The last senator who voted against the Federal Reserve, what he told his family before dying 1917. The rain over Jefferson City had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in gray sheets against the window panes of the old clapboard house on High Street, where the senator lay propped against 3 feather pillows, his hands folded over a quilt his mother had sewn 50 years earlier. The doctor had come and gone. The priest had come and gone. Now only family remained, his eldest son, Thomas Jr., a railroad lawyer with his father's hard jaw, his daughter, Mary, who had traveled from Philadelphia with her 2 small children, and his wife of 42 years, Eliza, who sat in the rocker by the fire without weeping anymore. The senator's name was Samuel C. Hammond, a name forgotten now, even in the state he had served for 3 terms. He had been a Democrat of the old school, a disciple of Grover Cleveland and John Peter Altgeld, a man who believed that gold was honest and that paper money was a lie whispered by bankers. In December 1913, he had risen in the Senate chamber and voted nay on the Federal Reserve Act. He was one of the last to do so. By 1917, most of those other nays had died or retired. Hammond remained, but not for long. His lungs were failing. Tuberculosis, the doctors said, though Hammond himself believed it was something else, a slow suffocation by the very system he had warned against. They took the air out of the room, he had told his wife 2 weeks earlier, and now I'm just the last man left holding his breath. On this evening, the 4th of November, 1917, he asked for the fire to be built higher and for the children to be brought close. His voice was a dry rustle, like corn husks in October. Don't lean too near, he said to his grandson, a boy of 6 named William. I'm not contagious. Just tired. Tired in the bone. Eliza set her hand on his. Sam, you don't have to talk. The doctor said rest. The doctor, Hammond whispered, and then he smiled, a thin, crooked smile that had once disarmed reporters and angered railroad barons in equal measure. The doctor works for the same people who passed that bill. They'd like me to rest. Resting is what they want. Quiet. But I wasn't quiet in the Senate, and I won't be quiet now. Thomas Jr. pulled a straight-back chair to the bedside. Father, if you have something to say it plainly. You taught me that. Hammond coughed, a deep, wet sound that made Mary turn her face away. He spat into a handkerchief, looked at the stain briefly, then folded the cloth and tucked it under his pillow. Plainly, he said. Yes. All right. He closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were the same fierce gray they had been in 1896, when he had campaigned for William Jennings Bryan and stood on flatbed trains yelling against the cross of gold. But now the fierceness had a different quality, not rage, but something like grief. You were all too young to remember 1907, he began. Thomas, you were at Harvard, reading law and learning how to serve masters you didn't yet know the names of. Mary, you were 16, dancing at the country club and thinking money came from your father's valise. But I remember. That October, the Knickerbocker Trust failed. Runs on banks from New York to San Francisco. Men jumped from windows. Farmers shot themselves in their barns because the banks called their notes. And what did the bankers do? They sat in J.P. Morgan's library, his private library, mind you, not a government building, and they decided which banks would live and which would die. Morgan himself played God with a pen. Eliza shifted in her rocker. Sam, you've told this story 100 times. And I'll tell it 100 more before dawn, he said, not harshly, but with the certainty of a man who knows he has only a few hours left. Because that's the seed. The panic of 1907 was the seed. Aldrich was the gardener. And the Federal Reserve, he paused, breathing shallowly. The Federal Reserve is the harvest. Mary spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, the voice of a woman who had learned to make herself small in the presence of her father's opinions. Papa, the war. We're in the war now. Isn't the Fed helping us finance the war? Isn't that good? Hammond turned his head slowly on the pillow. You think I don't know about the war? My son-in-law is in France. My nephew is at Camp Funston. I've lost 30 pounds worrying about boys I'll never meet. But listen to me, Mary, and let this be the last thing I say to you, if it has to be the last. The war is a fire. The Federal Reserve is a fire department that owns the arsonist's matches. Thomas Jr. leaned forward. Explain that. No riddles, father. We're not in the cloakroom now. All right. No riddles. Hammond pushed himself up an inch higher against the pillows, and his breath came in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if he were measuring each word against the weight of his remaining life. In 1913, when they brought the bill to the floor, I stood up and I said, this is not a reform. It is a surrender. And the men who had been my colleagues for 10 years, men like Carter Glass, who should have known better, they looked at me as if I had spoken in tongues. What are you afraid of, Sam? They asked. Elastic currency? A lender of last resort? The Europeans have central banks. Why shouldn't we? He coughed again, but waved off Eliza's reaching hand. I'll tell you what I was afraid of. I was afraid of a single thing, the concentration of power. Not gold. Not silver. Not inflation. Power. The Aldrich Plan failed because the people saw it for what it was, a banker's cartel dressed in government clothes. So the progressives, fooled by their own good intentions, took that same cartel and wrapped it in federal ribbon. They changed the name. They changed the number of districts. They put the president's appointees on the board. And then they said, see? It's public now. It's accountable. He laughed, and the laugh turned into a rattle, and the rattle into a silence that stretched for 10 heartbeats. It was never public, he said finally. Do you know who owns the Federal Reserve banks, Thomas? You're a lawyer. You know how to read incorporation papers. Thomas Jr. nodded slowly. The member banks. The commercial banks. Yes. The commercial banks. The same banks that caused the panic in 1907. The same banks that foreclosed on my neighbors in 93. They own the Federation. They elect 6 of the 9 directors of each regional bank. And the board in Washington? Appointed by the president, yes, but advised, consulted, and staffed by the same banking families who have run American finance since Hamilton. I'm not speaking of conspiracy, not in the cheap sense. I'm speaking of something worse, a natural harmony of interest. The bankers believe they should rule because they believe they know best. And the politicians believe the bankers should rule because the bankers have the money to re-elect them. Eliza stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Her back was to the bed. Sam, you're dying. Do you want your last words to be bitterness? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want my last words to be true. She did not turn around. Hammond looked at his son, then at his daughter. The fire popped. A log shifted. Somewhere in the kitchen, a kettle began to whistle. In 1914, Hammond continued, just after the Fed opened its doors, I went to New York. I asked for a meeting with Benjamin Strong, the man who ran the New York Federation. The real Fed, if you want to know the truth. The other districts are branches, New York is the trunk. I sat in his office at 33 Liberty Street. He had a model ship on his desk. A 3-masted schooner. I asked him, Governor Strong, who do you serve? And he looked at me. He was a tall man, handsome, confident, the kind of man who never doubted himself for a single minute. And he said, Senator, I serve the public interest by serving the banking system. They are the same thing. Hammond closed his eyes again, as if the memory still stung. I told him they were not the same. I told him that the public interest sometimes requires restraining the banking system, not serving it. He smiled. He had a perfect smile. And he said, "Senator, with respect, you do not understand modern finance." Then he picked up a paper from his desk and began to read, and the meeting was over. "Did he think you were a fool?" Mary asked. "I think he knew I was right, and that he had won anyway," Hammond said. "That is the difference between us. He won. I didn't. And now we have a central bank that is not quite private and not quite public, a hybrid monster that can print money without limit, lend it to banks without oversight, and call itself independent whenever anyone asks for accountability. In England, the Bank of England answers to Parliament. In Germany, the Reichsbank answers to the Chancellor. Here, the Fed answers to no one. It answers to the economy. And the economy, have you noticed? Always speaks with the voice of Wall Street." Thomas Jr. rubbed his chin. "Father, the Fed has only been operating for 3 years. It's too early to judge." 3 years, Hammond repeated, as if tasting the words. "In 3 years, they have already done immense damage. In 1915, they lowered interest rates to help banks buy war bonds, which, by the way, were issued by the Treasury at the Fed's advice. Do you see the circle? The banks buy bonds, the Fed creates the money to buy the bonds out of thin air, and the taxpayer pays the interest on the bonds. The banks take no risk. They collect a fee. And the people get a currency that inflates, slowly, like a tire with a small hole. You don't notice it at first. A penny here, a nickel there. But by 1925, the dollar that bought a loaf of bread will buy half a loaf. By 1935, a quarter loaf. And no one will remember who did it, because no single person did it. The system did it. The system that has no name and no face and no election." Eliza turned from the window. Her face was wet, but her voice was steady. "You're not going to solve this tonight, Sam. You're not going to warn the country. The country is at war. No one is listening." "Then let me warn my grandchildren," he said, and he gestured weakly toward little William, who had been sitting on the floor with a wooden train, not understanding a word. "William, come here." The boy stood up and walked to the bedside, his eyes wide. Hammond placed a hand on the child's head. "You will be a man someday," Hammond said. "And when you are, you will hear men say that money is complicated and that ordinary people should leave it to the experts. Do not believe them. Money is not complicated. Money is a promise. A dollar is a promise that someone worked for it, and that someone else will accept it for something of value. When the government, or the bankers, or the Fed, makes that promise too easily, they are stealing from you. Not from your pocket. From your labor. From your future. Do you understand?" The boy shook his head. Hammond smiled. "That's all right. Just remember this. When they tell you there is no alternative, they are lying. There is always an alternative. The alternative is to say no." He pulled his hand back and sank into the pillows, exhausted. Mary was crying now, silently. Thomas Jr. stared at the fire. Eliza returned to her rocker. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Hammond began to murmur, not to them, it seemed, but to himself, or to the ceiling, or to the ghost of the Senate chamber he had left behind. "I stood on the floor that day, December 22, 1913. Almost Christmas. The galleries were full. The other nays, let me see if I can remember them. Hitchcock? No, he voted yes at the last minute. Reed of Missouri? He was with me. Groner? Yes. And La Follette, of course. Bob La Follette stood beside me for 3 hours while they twisted arms and offered favors. They offered him a seat on the new Federal Reserve Board. Did you know that? They offered him a seat, and he refused. You cannot buy me, he said. I am not a horse. Hammond laughed again, and this time the laugh did not turn into a cough. But they bought others. Oh, They bought them so quietly. A bridge for a district here. A post office there. A promise not to fight the next tariff bill. And by the time the roll was called, we were only 4 senators who voted no. The rest had been persuaded, or threatened, or simply exhausted. And the bill passed. And Woodrow Wilson signed it. And the president, the man I had voted for, the man I had believed in, he put down his pen and said, "I have signed this bill because it will give us the best and safest banking system in the world." He opened his eyes and looked at his son with an expression that was almost apologetic. Wilson was a fool about money. A brilliant fool. He thought he could reconcile democracy with bankers. You cannot. Bankers will always seek to control democracy because democracy, left to itself, would regulate bankers. That is not cynicism, Thomas. That is history. Read your Bacot. Read your Marx. Yes, Marx, the man had a few useful things to say about credit. Read your William Jennings Bryan. The struggle is not between parties. It is between those who produce and those who lend. And the lender has always had the advantage, because the lender controls the story. He stopped. His breathing had become shallower, faster. Eliza rose and put a glass of water to his lips. He drank, spilled a little on the quilt, and lay back. "Father," Thomas Jr. said, "if you had won, if the Federal Reserve had not passed, what would we have instead?" Hammond was quiet for a long time. The rain drummed on the roof. The fire cracked. "I don't know," he said finally. "That is the honest answer. Maybe something better. Maybe something worse. But the question is not whether I had a perfect plan. The question is whether the people had the right to decide. We gave them a vote in 1913? No. We gave them a vote in 1912, when they elected Wilson and a Democratic Congress. But even then, the bill was written behind closed doors. At Jekyll Island. Do you know about Jekyll Island? I've heard stories, Thomas Jr. said. Not stories. Fact. In 1910, Senator Aldrich, a Republican, the tool of the money trust, took a group of bankers to a private island off the coast of Georgia. They went by train, under assumed names. They stayed for 10 days. And they wrote the outline of the Federal Reserve System. No members of Congress. No farmers. No labor leaders. Just bankers. They wrote the blueprint, and then they sold it to the country as a reform. Wilson believed the sales pitch. So did most of the progressives. And I was one of the few who had read the minutes of the Jekyll Island meeting. A clerk leaked them to me in 1912. I knew what they intended, and I knew they would lie about it. His voice dropped to a whisper. They intended to create a permanent cartel. A legalized monopoly on credit. They intended to make sure that no panic could ever threaten their power again, because they would control the printing press. And they intended to do it all in the name of stability. Not greed. Stability. That is the genius of it. They convinced themselves that their power was the people's safety. And maybe they even believed it. Eliza spoke from the rocker, her voice hard. You've been saying this for 10 years, Sam. And the sky hasn't fallen. The banks are open. The war is being financed. What exactly has gone wrong? Hammond turned his head toward her. For a moment, his face softened, the face of a young man who had courted her at a county fair in 1875, who had given her a gold locket with a lock of his hair inside. Eliza, he said, you have been my patience and my judgment. You have stopped me from making a fool of myself 100 times. But I need you to hear me now, because I will not be here to say it later. The sky hasn't fallen, yet. But the seeds are planted. In 10 years, you will see an orgy of speculation unlike anything this country has ever known. Cheap credit, easy money, and no one to say no. The Fed will create booms, and then it will create busts, and then it will claim that only the Fed can save us from the busts it created. That is the trap. That is the serpent eating its own tail. He coughed, a long, terrible spasm that doubled him over. Mary rushed to his side. Thomas Jr. lifted him gently. When the spasm passed, Hammond's face was ashen, and there was blood on his lip. "Get the doctor," Mary said. "No," Hammond said. "No more doctors. I've said what I needed to say." He reached out and took Thomas Jr.'s hand. His grip was still strong, astonishingly so for a dying man. "Son, you will be tempted to go into politics. I see it in you. Don't. They will ruin you or buy you. Instead, do this, teach. Teach economics to young people. Not the economics of the textbooks, the economics of the ledger book, the farm mortgage, the payroll. Teach them that money is not a mystery. Teach them that every dollar of debt is a dollar of power over someone else. And teach them that the Federal Reserve, for all its charts and reports and solemn pronouncements, is not their servant. It never was." Thomas Jr. said nothing. He nodded once. Then Hammond turned to Mary. "You have a son. Raise him to be suspicious of experts. Not because experts are always wrong, but because experts are always human. And humans with power over money become something less than human. They become machines for rationalizing their own advantage." Mary wiped her eyes. "Papa, I love you. But you were always too hard. The world isn't just bankers and victims. There are good people who work in banks. There are honest men who believe in the Federation." "I know," Hammond said. "That is what frightens me most. The honest men. The ones who mean well. They are the ones who build the cages. The corrupt ones just open the doors." He fell silent. The rain had stopped. Through the window, a sliver of moon appeared between the clouds. Eliza stood up and walked to the bedside. She sat on the edge of the mattress and took both of his hands in hers. "Sam," she said, "you voted no. You lost. But you voted no. That matters. When they write the history, if anyone ever writes it honestly, they will note that one man stood up and said no. Not because he was stubborn. Not because he hated progress. But because he knew that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." Hammond looked at her. His eyes were wet. "I would have liked to see 1920, he said. "Just to say I told them so." "Don't," Eliza said. "Don't end with that." He smiled. "You're right. I won't." He lifted one hand and touched her cheek. "Eliza, I loved the country. But I loved you more. And I am sorry that I spent so many years away from you, chasing a fight I could not win." She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "You came home. That's enough." The fire burned low. The children were sent to bed. Thomas Jr. and Mary sat by the window, speaking in whispers. Eliza never left his side. At 3 in the morning, Samuel Hammond opened his eyes one last time. He looked at the ceiling, then at the faces around him. "Remember," he said, "the vote was not about banking. It was about whether we would remain a republic of citizens or become a client state of creditors. I voted for the republic." He closed his eyes. At 3:17 a.m., on November 5, 1917, the last senator who voted against the Federal Reserve drew his final breath. Eliza did not close his eyes. She let them stay as they were, open, facing the ceiling, as if he was still watching for something. The next day, Thomas Jr. sent a telegram to the remaining nays, La Follette, Groner, and Reed. It read simply, "He held. We remember." La Follette replied a week later, after Hammond had been buried in the family plot under a cedar tree. The telegram was brief: "We were right. History will not thank us." History did not thank them. It barely remembered them. But in a small house in Jefferson City, on a rainy November night in 1917, One old man told his family the truth as he saw it, and then he died, still saying no. The telegram from La Follette arrived on a Tuesday, the same day they nailed the coffin shut. Eliza Hammond stood in the parlor, holding the yellow slip of paper as if it were a wounded bird. We were right. History will not thank us. She read it twice, then folded it and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Outside, the November wind had turned cold, and the cedar tree in the family plot swayed against a sky the color of iron. Thomas Jr. came in from the barn, his boots muddy, his face red from the cold. "The grave is ready," he said. "The preacher will be here at noon." Eliza nodded. "Your father would have hated a preacher." "He would have hated a lot of things," Thomas said. Then he caught himself. "But he would have loved that you're here." Mary descended the stairs with little William in her arms. The boy was still too young to understand death, but he knew something was wrong because his grandmother had not smiled in 2 days. He reached out and touched Eliza's cheek. "Where is Grandpa?" he asked. Eliza took his small hand in hers. "He went to a place where no one can lie to him anymore." The boy seemed satisfied with that answer. Mary set him down, and he ran off to chase a chicken in the yard. At noon, the preacher arrived, a young man, fresh from seminary, who had never met Samuel Hammond. He spoke of dust and ashes, of resurrection and grace. Eliza listened politely. Thomas Jr. stared at the cedar tree. Mary wept into a handkerchief. But when the preacher said, the senator was a man of conviction, Eliza felt something rise in her throat, not grief, but a strange, fierce pride. Yes, she thought. He was a man of conviction. And it killed him as surely as the tuberculosis. After the burial, the neighbors came. They brought casseroles and pies and the kind of quiet sympathy that fills a house with too many bodies and not enough air. They spoke in hushed tones about the war, about the boys in France, about the new Liberty bonds. No one mentioned the Federal Reserve. No one mentioned 1913. Late that night, when the last guest had gone and the dishes were stacked in the kitchen, Thomas Jr. found his mother sitting alone in her rocker by the cold fireplace. She had not lit a fire. The room was dark except for a single oil lamp on the sideboard. "Mother," he said, "you should sleep." She shook her head. "Your father talked in his sleep, you know. For 30 years. Mostly about crops and cattle and the price of corn. But in the last year, he talked about the Federation. He would turn and murmur things like discount rate and open market operations, words I had to look up in his books. He dreamed about it, Thomas. He dreamed about a system he could not stop." Thomas pulled up a chair. "Do you think he was right? About the worst still to come?" Eliza was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered. Outside, an owl called once, twice, 3 times. "I think," she said slowly, "that he saw something the rest of us could not see because we did not want to see it. He said the Fed would create booms and busts. He said it would make the rich richer and tell the poor that stability required their patience. He said that within 20 years, the country would not recognize itself, that the distance between a banker and a farmer would become a chasm no election could bridge." She paused, rubbing her thumb along the arm of the rocker. "I wanted him to be wrong. I prayed for him to be wrong. But he was never wrong about money. Not once. In 1893, when the banks failed, he told me to pull our savings out of the First National and put them in a lockbox under the floorboards. I thought he was being paranoid. 3 weeks later, the bank closed its doors. In 1907, he sold every railroad stock we owned 2 months before the panic. I thought he was throwing away our future. Then the market fell apart, and we were the only family on this street who did not lose a dime." She looked at her son. He understood something about the men who run money. He understood that they are not evil. That is what made him so afraid. Evil men can be stopped. Good men who believe they are doing good while building a machine that will one day crush millions? Those men cannot be stopped. Because they never see themselves in the mirror of history. They see only their intentions. Thomas leaned back in his chair. So what do we do? He told me not to go into politics. He told me to teach. But teaching feels like whispering into a hurricane. Eliza reached out and took his hand. Then whisper. That is what he did. He stood on the Senate floor, one of 4 men saying no, and he whispered into the hurricane. And now you know his name. And his grandchildren will know. And maybe 100 years from now, someone will find his speeches in a library, or read the congressional record from December 1913, and they will say, there was a man who saw it coming. He could not stop it. But he saw. Thomas squeezed her hand. Do you think that's enough? No, Eliza said. But it is the only weapon we have. Naming the thing before it devours you. She stood up, slowly, her joints aching with the cold and the weight of the day. She walked to the sideboard, opened a drawer, and pulled out a worn leather journal, her husband's journal, the one he had kept during his final year. Read this, she said, handing it to Thomas. He wrote it for you. The last entry is dated 2 days before he died. Thomas opened the journal. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smeared, but the words were legible. November 2nd, 1917. Thomas, if you are reading this, I am gone. Do not mourn me. I lived long enough to vote my conscience, which is more than most men can say. Here is what I could not tell you in person because I lacked the words. The Federal Reserve is not a bank. It is a court. It issues final judgments on who gets credit and who does not, on which industries live and which die, on whether your neighbor keeps his farm or loses it to the bank. And that court has no jury, no elected judge, no appeal except to the same men who sit on the bench. They will tell you it is apolitical. That is the lie. Everything about money is political. The only question is whether the politics happens in the open, where the people can see it, or behind closed doors, where the bankers whisper. I lost the vote. But I did not lose the argument. The argument goes on, with or without me. Carry it for a while. Then pass it to your children. Your father, Samuel C. Hammond. Thomas read the passage 3 times. Then he closed the journal and held it against his chest. The argument goes on, he repeated. Eliza nodded. Yes. And now it belongs to you. She bent down, kissed his forehead, and walked slowly up the stairs to her empty bedroom. The house creaked. The wind picked up. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, a long, low sound that seemed to carry the senator's last word across the Missouri darkness. Fictional, set in 1929. 12 years later, on a black October morning, an old woman named Eliza Hammond sat alone in the same rocker, listening to the radio. The announcer's voice was frantic. The stock market was collapsing. Banks were failing. Men were jumping from windows in New York. And in the parlor of the house on High Street, Eliza Hammond, now 83, her hands gnarled with arthritis, her eyes clouded with cataracts, reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded yellow telegram. We were right. History will not thank us. She pressed the telegram to her lips. Then she whispered to the empty room, You told them, Sam. You told them all. Outside, the cedar tree had grown tall. And beneath it, the last senator who voted against the Federal Reserve slept on, his no still echoing through the only court that mattered in the end, the court of a family that remembered.